Okay, let's dive into this explainer. You know, the modern world we live in right now, its borders, its politics, even how we understand trauma, it was all basically forged in the fire of one massive conflict, World War I. Spanning from 1914 to 1918, this was a clash that literally brought the world's great powers to their knees and fundamentally reshaped the entire global order. It's a truly fascinating, albeit really dark, story of how a single localized assassination sparked a catastrophic chain reaction. We're going to break down exactly how that happened, the terrifying reality of the battlefield, and the completely fractured world it left behind. To really grasp the sheer scale of this conflict, we're going to journey through 5 distinct phases: lighting the powder keg, the war of attrition, the machine of war, turning tides in tally, and finally, a fractured peace. So, starting off with Section 1, lighting the powder keg. The world in the early 20th century might have seemed pretty stable on the surface, but underneath, it was absolutely primed for an explosion. So the crucial point is really this acronym, MAIN. The origins of the war are incredibly complex, but MAIN sums it up perfectly: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. European powers were locked in a fierce arms race, building up massive standing armies, and they entangled themselves in these super rigid alliances, specifically the Triple Entente of France, Russia, and Britain, pitted against the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Add to that the intense imperialistic competition for colonies in Africa and Asia, and this fierce nationalistic pride bubbling up, especially in the multi-ethnic Balkans, an area often called the powder keg of Europe. All these long-term tensions created a highly fragile, completely combustible environment. All that powder just needed a spark, and, well, that spark came on June 28, 1914. In a bizarre twist of fate involving a literal wrong turn by his driver, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Bosnian Serb nationalist, and what followed was a tragic, unstoppable domino effect. Just 1 month later, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Because of those rigid alliances we just talked about, Russia mobilizes to support Serbia. Germany then declares war on Russia on August 1st, and then France on August 3rd, executing their Schlieffen Plan to invade neutral Belgium. By August 4th, Britain is pulled in to defend Belgium, declaring war on Germany. In a matter of just a few weeks, the entire continent was at war. Which brings us to Section 2, the war of attrition, and the devastating stalemate on the fronts. And this brilliantly illustrates a major disconnect. Military leaders went in with a totally 19th century mentality, expecting this glorious, quick war of movement. Germany's Schlieffen Plan relied on a rapid, decisive sweep through Belgium to just knock out France. But the 20th century reality? It was a brick wall. That rapid movement was violently halted at the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914. Both sides quite literally dug into the earth, resulting in a horrific, deadlocked stalemate that ended up defining the Western Front for years. Now let's zoom in on the visceral, terrifying experience of the individual soldier. Trench warfare meant men were trapped in static defensive lines. Picture this muddy landscape, heavily scarred by impenetrable tangles of barbed wire. Soldiers lived in horrific conditions right alongside rats and disease. And the constant, deafening artillery bombardments led to widespread and devastating psychological trauma that they called shell shock, which is what we understand today as PTSD. It was a miserable, grueling existence, where gaining even a few yards of territory cost thousands of lives. Because neither side could easily break through, it forced the invention of some truly horrifying new methods to destroy enemy lines. Let's look at Section 3, the machine of war. Here we see how rapid industrialization was newly applied to mass destruction. Think about this. In a war that literally started with men on horseback, military tech advanced at a terrifying pace. Poison gas was introduced by Germany at Ypres, blinding and suffocating troops. The British deployed the very first tanks at the Battle of the Somme to try and roll over those trenches. The sky became an entirely new battlefield, with aircraft used for dogfights and bombing. Beneath the waves, German U-boats terrorized supply lines. And, of course, improved machine guns made going over the top of the trenches almost certain death. But we really have to zoom out for a second, because this war wasn't just fought in the mud of the trenches. It demanded total war. Governments mobilized their entire economies and societies to sustain the war effort. We're talking strict civilian rationing and massive government propaganda campaigns to keep morale high. Crucially, as men were sent off to the front lines, millions of women entered the factories to build munitions, a massive societal shift that acted as the precursor to the Rosie the Riveter era. Total war also meant colonial and global involvement. Millions of troops were pulled from places like India, Africa, and the Anzac forces of Australia and New Zealand. This immense global mobilization was draining the world, and the grueling balance of power finally began to shift. Moving on to Section 4, Turning Tides and Tally. The year 1917 was the absolute pivot point here. First, the Russian Revolution brought the Bolsheviks to power, which pulled Russia out of the war via the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and freed up German forces. But Germany definitely overplayed its hand. Their unrestricted submarine warfare, combined with the incredibly audacious Zimmermann telegram, which, get this, secretly urged Mexico to attack the U.S., provoked America into joining the Allies. This massive influx of fresh American troops ultimately pushed Germany to finally sign the armistice on November 11, 1918. So, the guns finally fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. But the cost? The cost was staggering, between 16 and 20 million deaths. Let that sink in for a moment. That is an unimaginable human cost that literally wiped out an entire generation. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the breakdown. We often think of war casualties mainly in terms of soldiers on the battlefield, and roughly 8.5 to 11 million military personnel did perish. But the grim reality of total war meant that 6 to 13 million civilians died right alongside them. Civilians died from war-induced famine, horrific events like the Armenian genocide carried out by the Ottoman Empire, and the devastating Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 and 1919. That flu spread so rapidly through troop movements that it ultimately killed even more people than the combat itself in some estimates. The fighting had stopped, but the world was left completely broken. Which brings us to our final section, a fractured peace. The treaties that ended the war drastically redrew the map of the world. They created borders in the Middle East and Europe that are literally still driving geopolitical conflicts today. The Treaty of Versailles placed incredibly heavy penalties squarely on Germany. They were forced to accept full war guilt, pay massive financial reparations, and lose significant territory and colonies. Meanwhile, 4 great empires completely collapsed. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires were dissolved entirely. New nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia emerged. Globally, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's vision led to the creation of the League of Nations, an early attempt at an international peacekeeping body. Let's move to and see how this builds, because these political treaties directly triggered sweeping transformations across the globe. Germany suffered crippling hyperinflation and economic ruin. Socially, the massive role women played during the war led to the advancement of women's suffrage in many countries. Politically, the devastation birthed entirely new ideologies. It accelerated the rise of communism in the Soviet Union and acted as a major catalyst for fascism in Italy and Germany. Culturally, the writers and artists who survived became known as the Lost Generation, producing profound anti-war literature and modern art to process their collective trauma. World War I effectively and violently ended the long 19th century. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. World War I was called the war to end all wars, but look at the aftermath. Did the incredibly harsh, punitive terms of the Treaty of Versailles, combined with the unresolved nationalistic grievances and the economic ruin it caused, simply set the stage for an even deadlier conflict? As history tells us, political figures like Adolf Hitler would directly exploit these very grievances, weaponizing the resentment of Versailles to rally a nation. The devastating total war and industrialized killing of World War I didn't end all wars. Tragically, it foreshadowed the even greater horrors of World War II. It remains a powerful cautionary tale about the absolute dangers of unchecked nationalism and the terrifying speed of military escalation.